Mhm. Hi, everyone. Hi, Dale. Hi, Jeffrey. Nice to see you here. I think the others will be along soon. So, I think I'm going to start, but I'd like to know if you can hear me well and if I have an echo. If my sound is good, I'll start. So, please give me some feedback. Okay, do I hear an echo or am I echo free tonight? Please let me know. Okay, this is Joe Firestone, and I'm here for New Macro Media with the In Depth Show. I know I've got a comment from Bonnie because my system has notified me of that, but I can't see the comment yet. There's a little bit of a delay. Anyway, please let me know if my sound is all right. I'm sorry, say that again. Very, very slight. Okay. That should moderate it a bit. Dale says sounds fine. Okay, that's good. So, what is the greatest scam or the great scam? That will be revealed very quickly by my first article. So here we go. Let me get that up for you. It's from Truthdig, and the title is The Greatest Scam in History is Taking Us All Down. It was published on November 11th. And here's a great photo of a fire. A photo of a wildfire. And the article is by Naomi Oreskes of Tom Dispatch, and it originally appeared at Tom Dispatch, I'm sure. And she says, it's a tale for all time. It might be the greatest scam in history, or at least the one that threatens to take history down with it. Think of it as the climate change scam that beats science big time. Scientists have been seriously investigating the subject of human-made climate change since the late 1950s, and political leaders have been discussing it for nearly as long. In 1961, Alvin Weinberg, the director of Oak Ridge National Laboratory, called carbon dioxide one of the big problems of the world, on whose solution the entire future of the human race depends, unquote. Fast forward nearly 30 years, and in 1992, President George H.W. Bush signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, promising, quote, concrete action to protect the planet, unquote. Today, with Puerto Rico still recovering from Hurricane Maria, fires burning across California, we know that did not happen. Despite hundreds of scientific reports and assessments, tens of thousands of peer reviewed scientific papers, countless conferences on the issue, man made climate change is now a living crisis on this planet. By universities, foundations, churches, and individuals have indeed divested from fossil fuel companies, and led by a 16-year-old Swedish girl, citizens across the globe have taken to the streets to express their outrage. Children have refused to go to school on Fridays to protest the potential loss of their future. And if you need a measure of how long but some of us have been at this, in December, the Conference of Parties to the UNFCCC will meet for the 25th time. Scientists who are working on the issue have often told me that once upon a time they assumed if they did their jobs, politicians would act upon the information. That, of course, hasn't happened. Anything but, okay, across much of the planet. Worse yet, science failed to have the necessary impact, in significant part because of disinformation that is promoted by the major fossil fuel companies, which have succeeded in diverting attention from climate change and successfully blocking meaningful action. Much focus has been put on ExxonMobil's history of disseminating disinformation, partly because of the documented discrepancies between what that company said in public about climate change and what its officials said and funded in private. Recently, a trial began in New York City accusing the company of misleading its investors, while the state of Massachusetts is prosecuting ExxonMobil for misleading consumers as well. If only it had just been that one company, but for more than 30 years, the fossil fuel industry and its allies have denied the truth about anthropogenic global warming. They've systematically misled the American people and so purposely contributed to endless delays in dealing with the issue by, among other things, discounting and disparaging climate science, actually misrepresenting scientific findings, and attempting to discredit climate scientists. These activities are documented in great detail how Americans were deliberately misled about climate change, which is a report I recently co authored, as well as my 2010 book, which is linked to in this article, and 2014 film, Merchants of Doubts. A key aspect of the fossil fuel industry disinformation campaign was the mobilization of third-party allies, organizations and groups with which it would collaborate, and that in some cases, it would be responsible for creating. In the 90s, these allied outfits included the Global Climate Coalition, the Cooler Heads Coalition, Informed Citizens for the Environment, and the Greening Earth Society. Like ExxonMobil, such groups endlessly promoted a public message of denial and doubt, that we weren't really sure if climate change was happening, that the science wasn't settled, that humanity could, in any case, but readily adapt at a later date to any changes that did occur, that addressing climate change directly would wreck the American economy. Two of these groups, Informed Citizens for the Environment and the Greening Earth Society, were in fact astroturf organizations created and funded by coal industry trade associations, but dressed up to look like grassroots citizens action organizations. Similar messaging was pursued by a network of think tanks promoting free market solutions to social problems, many with ties to the fossil fuel industry. These included the George C. Marshall Institute, the Cato Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, and the Heartland Institute. Often their politically motivated contrarian claims were presented in formats that made them look like the scientific reports whose science they were contradicting. 2009, for instance, the Cato Institute issued a report that precisely mimicked the format, layout, and structure of the government's U.S. National Climate Assessment. Of course, it made claims thoroughly at odds with the actual report's science. The industry also promoted disinformation through its trade associations, including the American uh, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, the American Petroleum Institute, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Black Chamber of Commerce, and the National Association of Manufacturers. Both think tanks and trade organizations have been involved in personal attacks on the reputations of scientists. One of the earliest documented ones was on climate scientist Benjamin Sankter at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, who showed that the observed increase in global temperatures could not be attributed to increased solar radiation. And then the article goes on to say that he was the lead author of the second assessment report, okay, of the IPCC, uh, which was responsible for the 1995 conclusion that the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human impact on the climate system. Anyway, he became the target of vicious, arguably defamatory attacks by physicists from the Marshall Institute and the Global Climate Coalition, who accused him of fraud. Other climate scientists, um, 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 in, including Michael Mann, Jonathan Overpeck, Malcolm Hughes, Ray Bradley, Catherine Cahill, and I should note myself, have been subject to harassment, investigation, hacked emails, and politically motivated freedom of information attacks. How to play climate change for a fool is the next section. When it came to industry disinformation, the role of third party allies was on full display at the House Committee on Oversight hearings on climate change in late October. As their sole witness, the Republicans on that committee um, um, invited Mandy Gunasekera, the founder and president of Energy 45, a group whose purpose, in its own words, is to, quote, support the Trump energy agenda, unquote. Energy 45 is part of a group known, bluntly enough, as the CO2 Coalition, and is a perfect example of what I've long thought of as zombie denialism, in which older players spouting industry arguments suddenly reappear in new forms. In this case, in the 1990s and early 2000s, the George C. Marshall Institute was a leader in climate change disinformation. From 1974 to 1999, its director, William O'Keefe, had also been the executive vice president and later CEO of the American Petroleum Institute, which, by the way, was a very, very well-funded institute. The Marshall Institute itself closed in 2015, only to reemerge a few years later as the CO2 Coalition. The article then goes into comments, of the Republican committee members who offered 6 so-called facts. One, the misleading change that climate change will be mild and also manageable. There's no scientific evidence for this. And the article goes on to describe why there's no scientific evidence. and it brings in all the recent events: Hurricane Sandy, Michael, Harvey, Maria, okay, and Dorian, as well as a devastating wildfire in Paradise, California in 2018, and the fires across much of that state this fall have shown the impacts of climate change are already part of our lives and becoming unmanageable. Yes, already. And two, the misleading claim that global prosperity is actually being driven by fossil fuels. No, that's not true anymore. It's disruptive climate change, which is being fueled by fossil fuels and the greenhouse gases that they create, and that they now threaten both the prosperity that parts of this planet have already achieved and future economic growth of just about any sort. Okay, Nicholas Stern, the former chief economist of the World Bank and one of the foremost experts on the economics of climate change, has put our situation succinctly this way, quote, high carbon growth self-destructs, unquote. Three, the misleading claim that fossil fuels actually represent cheap energy. No, they're not cheap, but you have to include their external costs. Now, right now, we don't figure in their external costs. We don't impose the external costs on the fossil fuel companies. If we did, there would be no fossil fuel companies in business today. Okay. If you take into account the fires, the extreme storms, the flooding, the health effects, and everything else that the carbon emissions into the atmosphere are going to bring about, they couldn't be more expensive. The IMF estimates cost to consumers above and beyond what we pay at the pump or in our electricity bills already comes to more than $5 trillion annually. That's trillion, not the billion. But put another way, we're all paying a massively, largely unnoticed subsidy to the oil, gas, and coal industries to destroy our civilization. Makes a lot of sense, right? Four, a misleading claim about poverty and fossil fuels. That fossil fuels are the solution to the energy needs of the world's poor is a tale being heavily promoted by ExxonMobil, okay, among others. Okay, and of course, this is a silly, 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 laughable idea. As Pope Francis, Mary Robinson, and former UN Secretary General Ban Ki moon, as well as countless others, have said, climate change will above all hurt the poor. It is they who will first be uprooted from their homes and homelands. It is they who will be migrating into an increasingly hostile and walled-in world. It is they who will truly feel the heat, both literal and figurative, of it all. A fossil fuel company that cared about the poor would obviously not be committed above all else to pursuing a business model based on oil and gas exploration and development. Cynicism of this argument is truly astonishing. Five, misleading assertions about the costs of renewable energy. Uh, so, according to Bloomberg News, in two-thirds of the world, solar is already the cheapest form of newly installed electricity generation, cheaper than nuclear, natural gas, or coal. Improvements in energy storage are needed to maximize the penetration of the renewables, uh, and this is actually particularly true in developed countries, but these improvements are happening quickly. Between 2010 and 2017, the price of battery storage decreased a startling 79%. Just in the last couple of weeks, there's been a breakthrough in storage capacity in connection with the development of carbon, okay, and lithium batteries that promises to be commercial very soon, actually. Six, the false claim that under President Trump, okay, the U.S. has actually cut our greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, and Republicans have claimed Not only that such emissions have fallen, but that the U.S. under President Trump has done more to reduce emissions than any other country on the planet. What a joke. One environmental reporter who has described herself as is accustomed to hearing a lot of misinformation about climate change, characterized this statement as brazenly false. In fact, in fact, U.S. CO2 emissions spiked in 2018, increased by 3.1% over 2017. Okay, methane emissions are also on the rise, very fast, by the way. And President Trump's proposal to roll back uh, 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 methane standards will ensure that this unhappy trend continues. It's not just unhappy, it's a big, big, big threat in the area of accelerating the climate emergency. By the way, when it comes to the oil companies, that's just to start down a far longer list of misinformation and false claims they've been peddling for years. In our 2010 book, uh, uh, 2010 book, the Merchants of Doubt, Eric Conway and I showed that the strategies and tactics used by big energy to deny the harm of fossil fuel use were in many cases remarkably similar to those long used by the tobacco industry to deny the harm of tobacco use. This was no coincidence. Many of the same PR firms, advertising agencies, and institutions were involved in both cases. The tobacco industry was finally prosecuted by the Department of Justice, uh, and the industry was pegged with a wide range of activities it funded to mislead the American people. Something similar has occurred with big energy and the harm fossil fuels are doing to our lives, our civilization, and our planet. Still, a crucial question about the fossil fuel industry remains to be fully explored. Which of its companies have funded the activities of the trade organizations and other third party allies who deny the facts about climate change? In some cases, we already know the answer. 2006, for instance, the Royal Society of the UK documented ExxonMobil's funding 39 organizations that actually promoted inaccurate and misleading views of climate science. And the society was able to identify 2.9 million spent to that end by that company in the year 2005 alone. That, of course, was just 1 year and clearly anything but the whole story. Nearly all of these third party allies are incorporated as 501c3 institutions, which means they must be nonprofit and nonpartisan. Often they claim to be involved in education, although miseducation would be the more accurate term. But they're clearly also involved in supporting an industry, specifically big energy, that couldn't be more for profit, and they have done many things to support what could uh, only be called a partisan political agenda as well. After all, by its own admission, Energy 45, to take just one example, exists to support the quote Trump energy agenda unquote. It seems to me that's highly partisan and well worthy of lifting the tax exemption of Energy 45. I'm an educator, not a lawyer, but as one I can say with confidence that the activities of these organizations are the opposite of educational. Typically, the Heartland Institute, for instance, explicitly targeted school teachers with disinformation. 2017, the Institute sent a booklet to more than 200,000 of them, repeating the oft-cited contrarian claims that climate science is still a highly unsettled subject, and even if climate change were occurring, would probably not be harmful. Of this booklet, the director of the National Center for Science Education said, quote, "It's not science, but it's dressed up to look like science. It's clearly intended to confuse teachers," unquote. The National Science Teaching Association has called it, quote, "propaganda," unquote, and advised teachers to place their copies in the recycling bin. Yet, as much as we know about the activities of Heartland and other third party allies of the fossil fuel industry, because of loopholes in our laws, we still lack basic information about Who has funded and sustained them? Much of the funding at the moment still qualifies as dark money. Isn't it time for citizens, to demand that Congress investigate this network as it and the Department of Justice once investigated the tobacco industry and its networks? ExxonMobil loves to accuse me of being an activist. I am, in fact, a teacher and a scholar. Most of the time, I'd rather be home working on my next book, but that increasingly seems like less of an option when Big Energy's climate change scam is ongoing. Our civilization is quite literally at stake. When citizens are inactive, democracy fails. And this time, if democracy fails, as burning California shows, so much else could fail as well. Science isn't enough. The rest of us are needed, and we are needed now. Yes, we are. We certainly are needed now. And the next article we'll go through is from Ryan Padevero at The Intercept, and it's called Everything So Far Has Failed. Why ExxonMobil is being taken to court over climate change. So, in other words, it started. The fossil fuel companies are now being taken to court. And this article is about the New York State Supreme Court, and it starts by describing the building as critical, as a place where critical legal battles have been fought for nearly a century. But the storied building somehow felt outmatched by the gravity of the matter at hand. Two legal teams were crammed shoulder to shoulder around wooden tables. Spectators and curious out-of-state attorneys filled the benches behind them. Reporters hunched over their laptops. A tattooed court officer strolled the periphery of the room looking for rule breakers. If you squinted, it could be any of the many high-profile trials that come through New York City, and not, as many hope it will be, a historic test of whether the industry responsible for setting humanity on a path to uh, uh, immolation can be held to account before it's too late. The failure of the international community to strongly grapple with climate change and the rollbacks under the Trump administration are leaving advocates of strong climate action desperate for whatever tools they can use, quote unquote. The case was the people of the state of New York versus ExxonMobil Corp., which concluded last week. It is part of a wave of litigation directed at the titans of the fossil fuel industry that is making its way through courts across the country. Quote, it's only the second climate change case ever to go to trial in the United States, unquote. That was said, by Michael Gerard, a Columbia Law School professor and one of the world's leading experts on climate liability, lawsuits, litigation, actually. And quote, quote again, and it's the first where the plaintiffs were able to obtain discovery from any of the fossil fuel companies. Should New York Attorney General Letitia James succeed in the case, ExxonMobil could be on the hook for up to $1.6 billion, in damages. That's certainly a substantial amount, but it's also a drop in the bucket when it comes to ExxonMobil, of course, which is one of the most profitable companies in existence. Quote, the failure of the international community to strongly grapple with climate change and the rollbacks under the Trump administration, leaving advocates of strong climate action desperate for whatever tools they can use. So many are resorting to the courts. The Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, which Gerard runs and is aimed at training by future lawyers in the climate field, has tallied the filing of 1,000 climate change lawsuits in the U.S. But the trend, he said, is not confined to the U.S. He says we're seeing an upswing in that kind of litigation, not only in the U.S. But also globally. On paper, the ExxonMobil case in New York was not about the climate crisis, at least not directly. Instead, the suit was about representations Exxon made to its shareholders about potential future costs, that were related to the crisis. Those representations, the General's Office claimed, were false and amounted to an enormous case of securities fraud. We're not telling Exxon how to run its business, prosecutor Kevin Wallace told Judge but, but told Justice Barry Strazier in his opening statement. Quote, "It was and is always free to change its business practices, but it has to be honest with investors. The company failed to manage the risks in the way it promised. The cost of that failure are staggering. Investors are now entitled to the truth and their recompense." It was the careful framing of a prosecutor angling to win a case, but there was clearly more to the trial than that. A deeper explanation for the electric feeling that was running through Stradger's courtroom. There was a reason for the long line of people trying to get into the room that afternoon, and it was not some newfound mass public interest in complex securities fraud, by fraud litigation. People were drawn in because a seemingly untouchable corporation at the top of the industry responsible for the climate emergency was facing potentially serious damage in a publicly observable fashion. And it was not the only one. As reporters stood in line, waiting for opening arguments to begin in New York, news broke that the Supreme Court had rejected a plea from more than 2,000 of the multinational energy companies, ExxonMobil included, to block a state level lawsuit filed by the city of Baltimore, one of more than a dozen filed by state and local governments across the country. The suit is one of several public nuisance cases with the potential to open up the fossil fuel industry to liability for its climate impacts in individual localities and communities. The following day, as witnesses in New York began to testify, the Massachusetts Attorney General's office filed its own lawsuit against ExxonMobil, an even more sweeping case than the one unfolding in Lower Manhattan. There's an interconnected history running through this. And, okay, I'm not going to go through this whole article, but the basic point is, uh, well, I will mention, that New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, a month after the stories broke, subpoenaed ExxonMobil for extensive financial records, emails, other documents, and the attorneys general of Massachusetts and the Virgin Islands announced they would be joining New York in investigating the company. So, point is, the investigations have started now, and they're going on, and they are vigorous. There was pushback, from ExxonMobil, who said the inquiries were politically motivated and based on discredited reporting by activist organizations, quote unquote. The companies made efforts to block the probes, and the pressure had an effect. The Massachusetts Attorney General, the Attorney General for the Virgin Islands withdrew his subpoena for nearly 4 decades worth, of Exxon documents, but the subpoenas are still there from New York, Massachusetts. Okay, one thing Exxon did in response to the investigations was to hire Ted Wells, one of the nation's most prominent white-collar defense attorneys. His clients have ranged from I. Louis Scooter Libby, the former advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney, to financial giants such as Citigroup, Bank of America, and J.P. Morgan. In other words, he represents the usual suspects. Ted Wells, uh, the lead attorney for Exxon. That's a picture of him that I just scrolled past. Looks like a character out of a Bond movie, doesn't he? He probably saw just that effect. He was leaving the New York Supreme Court after opening arguments in a lawsuit, okay, against Exxon on October 22nd, okay, in New York City. So he starts talking about the lack, okay, of objectivity, okay, and fairness, okay, and trying to say that these lawsuits happen to be politically motivated. Well, they may be politically motivated. I mean, very often lawsuits are politically motivated, but so what? That doesn't say anything about the validity, okay, the lawsuit. It's like an ad hominem attack. In other words, the fact that Hitler said something doesn't make it untrue. And political motivation behind a lawsuit does not make the lawsuit invalid. There is an act in New York which is known as the Martin Act. It's an anti-fraud law that grants prosecutors sweeping authority to investigate publicly traded companies. It's the strictest anti-fraud law in the country. The Martin Act does not require prosecutors to establish any proof of fraudulent intent. The law was the basis for New York Attorney General investigation in the early 2000s that led to 1.4 billion in fines extracted from some of the financial sector's biggest banks. Instead of New York, the Massachusetts ExxonMobil case has to date offered the nearest example of a broad targeting of the fossil fuel company that many had expected. Uh, there was a 211-page complaint by Attorney General Maura Healey accused Exxon of systematically and intentionally misleading Massachusetts investors and consumers about climate change. Uh, and that's being pursued very vigorously. New York and Massachusetts cases are the high-profile phase of a multi-pronged attack on the fossil fuel industry, Gerard said, quote unquote. He added, though, that it's far too early to predict how all this is going to play out, unquote. He declined to speculate on which of the various challenges uh, would be the ones that Exxon might be most worried about. He said they're very vigorously defending all of them. To Bill McKibben, the environmentalist, author, and founder of 350.org, the current moment feels like the start of a new chapter. He told The Intercept, quote, the underlying offenses started a very long time ago, the very end of the 1980s and the 1990s, with the decision to build this architecture of deceit and denial around whether climate change was real, a question that the oil companies knew full well the answer to, unquote. Okay, now that's a very key point. If they knew well that climate change was real, and I contend they might have known it was real back as early as the 1970s, and then they carried out a campaign to mislead the public, okay, about whether it was real, okay, or was not real. That is certainly fraud. Fraud on consumers and fraud on investors as well. And quote, says Bill McKibben, quote, we're at the very beginning of what will be a long official reckoning for one of the really astonishing crimes of our time. The article then talks about a number of other very interesting events. Times are fleeting, and I want to cover some other things here. So I think I've said enough to indicate that the issue of legal accountability of the fossil fuel industry has now been taken up uh, in earnest. And a lot of interesting things are going on. And there's a possibility that the fossil fuel industry, like the tobacco industry before it, will be brought up to account, and there will be very serious measures taken against it and very serious penalties in the offing. Okay, the tobacco industry and the harm that it did, of course, it was a great deal, and was serious enough. But the harm the fossil fuel industry has done threatens our very existence as a species and the existence of many other species, as well. It severely impacts the future, of the Earth. It's 1,000 times, perhaps 1,000,000 times more serious uh, than the frauds that were committed by the tobacco industry. And the people who perpetrated these frauds need to be brought to account. So, I want to move on to another subject, at this point. But I thought it was important, for you to know that these suits are moving forward and things are shaping up in such a way that it looks like there will be penalties for the company in not but too long a time. So, just a brief item. Now, next, there's been a serious study of the war on terror, both in terms of fatalities caused by the war, on terror, and also in terms, of dollars. There's a project called the Cost of War Project, at Brown University's Watson Institute for International, Public Affairs, and it has released a study, in which, it's estimated that since September 11, 2001, the war on terror that's been launched by the United States government has cost at least 801,000 lives and $6.4 trillion. The numbers continue to accelerate, not only because there are many wars that continue to be waged, but also because wars don't end when the soldiers come home, said Cost of War co-director and Brown professor Catherine Lutz, who co-authored the project's report on deaths. And the reports, but she said, actually provide a reminder that even if fewer soldiers are dying and the U.S. is spending a little less on the immediate cost of war today, the financial impact is still as bad or worse than it was 10 years ago. Let's add, quote, we'll still be paying the bill for these wars on terror into the 22nd century. Well, I don't know about that, because there are various ways in which we can take care of the financial impact. But the costs of war, in terms of people killed and disruptions to society, will echo down the decades. certainly they will be felt into the 22nd century. Okay, so anyway, I commend this article to you. Okay, I have given you the link. This The civilian death totals across all regions is up to 335,745, nearly 42% of the total figure, but the report does not include the indirect deaths, many of those caused by loss of access to food, water, and our infrastructure. Okay. Those deaths are generally estimated to be four times higher, said David Vine, who's a professor, okay, at American University. Okay, there was an op-ed in The Hill, okay, about that, which is linked to from here. If the costs of war are four times as high, okay, and if the direct deaths are 801,000, and the indirect deaths are generally estimated to be four times higher, then we're looking at uh, about 2 million deaths, as I read it. So I commend to you this article. It's very important to note these costs, to track these costs, and to take them into account when contemplating other interventions, especially in connection with the Trump administration at this point, but also in relation to any new Democratic administration that's likely to take over in 2021 or before that time. Uh, Wherever we get involved in a heavy military intervention somewhere, the costs are astronomical. We do much too much of that. We are intervening too much in many, many nations around the world, and the consequences are bloody. Even when they are not bloody for us, they are bloody for the people, okay, of many other nations. Uh, Even the effects of our diplomacy, okay, and our economic behavior, okay, and actions are even now resulting in the deaths, okay, of Latin Americans. So not only the Middle East is affected, other areas of the world, okay, are affected, okay, as well. We don't take into account the consequences, okay, of our diplomacy sufficiently frequently. Okay, moving on. There's an extended comment by Rafael Correa, the former president, okay, of Ecuador, the Jacobin, and this is okay, in the form of an interview by Jacobin. And he said to Jacobin, quote, "Clearly what happened in Bolivia was a coup." The interview was by Nicholas Allen. And here it is. I think the interview came out only today. Let me double check that. Right. It was published today. Okay, 11/16. So, okay, Correa was the president of Ecuador from 2007 to 17. Ranks among the greatest leaders of the pink tide, coming to power in a land ravaged by poverty and crippled by austerity, okay, and privatization programs. He oversaw a transformation, okay, of Ecuador in his decade-long tenure. The the minimum wage more than doubled. Billions were invested in healthcare, and poverty was cut in half. His story is very similar to that of the recently ousted Evo Morales, who was not just the first indigenous president of the Bolivians, but their most successful president. Since his first election in 2005, he presided over the most consistently high economic growth, okay, in Latin America, also slashing poverty and poverty and illiteracy. Yet did not win him the support, okay, of all Bolivians. After 3 weeks of armed demonstrations fanning out from the country's eastern provinces, last weekend the Army Whole Command told Evo Morales to go. The coup's organizers hail from the traditionally reactionary sections of the country. The key coup leader, by Fernando Camacho, businessman from the Santa Cruz province, went to La Paz last weekend, promising to, quote, bring God back into the presidential palace, unquote. And like Brazil's far right president, Jair Bolsonaro, Camacho combines Christian rhetoric with open racism towards indigenous people and intense anti-communism, but there's no communism anywhere that I can see. Such themes are the cutting edge of a bid to criminalize the social movements, okay, and the progressive leaders who have come to prominence in Latin America in the recent years. So here's the interview itself. Okay, so Alan says, let's start with the most pressing problem, which is Bolivia. How do you understand what's happening there? He said, when the police are rioting and the military suggests the president resigns, it's very clearly a coup d'etat. In Brazil or Argentina or China, we'd call this a coup. But some people do not like to call things by their real names. Yes, Evo Morales did resign, but if someone holds a gun to your head and says, very politely, give me your wallet, quote unquote, and you give it to them, does this mean that it wasn't a robbery, okay, but agreed, okay, by mutual consent? Clearly, what happened in Bolivia was a coup. Okay, then Alan's next question, as well as the military, okay, the domestic security forces in certain sectors of the Bolivian society, it seems the Organization, okay, of American States was also a factor in this coup. And Correa responded, Okay, the OAS states toe the U.S. line, and they usually act in concert. We've seen how the OAS has reacted to not just the Bolivian crisis, but also the one, okay, in Ecuador. When the Ecuadorian people rose up against the betrayals, okay, of President Lenin Moreno, insisting on the need, okay, for early elections as the Constitution allows in time of crisis. The OAS stated that he must complete his 4-year term. It preferred deaths, injuries, and arrests, okay, to a vote that the president would clearly have lost, like the servant of Washington that he is. OAS General Secretary Luis Almagro even went to Ecuador to congratulate Moreno on his democratic spirit, right as he was robbing democracy from us. But the OAS didn't say Morales ought to finish his term. How can we explain such a double standard? Latin America must reflect on the OAS's role. There's no doubt that Washington carries a predominant hegemonic weight in the OAS. Yeah, because we cover 60% of its expenses. And obviously, Almagro is a spokesman for Washington. Don't take me for an anti gringo. I love the United States deeply. I lived there for 4 years, and I have 2 degrees from universities in the U.S. But I have to say that the OAS acts like a loyal watchdog. As the colonial ministry for the United States, it is merely an instrument for defending uh, um, U.S. interests, and has demonstrated this very clearly during the Bolivian crisis. It's tragic, okay, for Evo Morales' administration to be defeated like this. What is your evaluation of his government? Is it a model for the region? Correa says, of course, it is something extraordinary. What was Bolivia like before Evo Morales? What this government accomplished is impressive. It had some of the best, um, 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 some of the best, uh, the best of the macroeconomic indicators on the planet. It raised 1/3 of the population out of poverty. It radically reduced illiteracy and had among the lowest unemployment rates in the region. But those who overthrew Morales believe in prosperity for some and not for others. If you offer our elite a chance to be more prosperous but equal with everyone else, they'll say no. Their power is based on equality. That's how they dominate us and guarantee their own well being. Sound familiar, everyone? I mean, sounds to me like he's describing the United States as well and not simply Bolivia. This is difficult to understand because we tend to compare contemporary Latin America with the contemporary United States. But it would make more sense to compare our situation to the era of slavery in the United States when Abraham Lincoln had to face a civil war in order to abolish slavery when the Confederate States seceded. When Lincoln was killed, John Wilkes Booth yelled, quote, Sic semper tyrannis, unquote. For the slaveholders, Lincoln was a tyrant. And things are the same here today. They want a kind of exclusion that maintains poverty and keeps South America as the most unequal continent on the planet. When they talk about freedom, they only want rights for themselves. To that end, they'll go to whatever lengths to eliminate you. That's what happened in Bolivia. The economic indicators, the progress, the prosperity, the equality was spectacular. But the Bolivian elite's assumptions are profoundly racist. That an Indio has done all this, okay, an Indian has done all this, and granted rights to the poorest, to those with dark skin, to the indigenous, or as they call them, the cholos. All this is unacceptable for them. So they use their mass media to hammer Morales and whip up the real powers in society, like the armed forces. Okay, and the next question, okay, from Nicholas Allen. As you say, in many countries, uh, when we go from Argentina to Brazil and Ecuador, it's become common to talk about popular figures, okay, like Evo Morales as tyrants, quote unquote, cynically employing, okay, a democratic rhetoric. In this sense, the coup in Bolivia today isn't the same as the ones in the 1970s. It speaks the language of democracy, of the rule of law, of fighting corruption. Corruption. Sometimes we even hear the term lawfare, quote unquote. How would you read the strategy of the Democratic right, quote unquote, for Democratic, at the regional level? Question mark. And Correa says, first, Latin American elites don't believe in democracy. Democracy is fine, so long as it aligns with their interest. That when there's a risk that something might change, they will do anything to fight it. They don't believe in equality either. Some of the elites who are applauding the coup may even have been sympathetic to a president who wanted to create better schools for their servants' children. But they could also assassinate the same president if he tried to create schools for these children equal to the ones for the elites. Uh, okay, when I look at this, I'm sure he's right, but I have to also think about what attitudes have developed here in the United States. It certainly looks like our leaders, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, certainly Donald Trump, certainly the Clintons, like far too high a percentage of our elite don't believe in equality. They don't believe in it. They don't think it's a good thing to fight for. They don't aspire to it, which means they don't believe in democracy because a key feature of democracy is greater equality for all. Moving back to the article. Second, U.S. governments actually believe in democracy at home. I think I dispute that. I wish it were true. But also think they need to replace foreign governments if they don't align with U.S. foreign policy. Even if these governments are more democratic than the United States itself, they need replacing with bloody dictators. That's how things were during the 1970s. Today, these types of dictatorships are no longer possible in South America. It was possible in Honduras in 2009, but it's more difficult elsewhere. So there are new strategies, so called soft coups, that exploit popular dissatisfaction to try to destabilize governments. But in Bolivia, we see a coup that has involved an insurgent armed force, okay, the police rioting, and the army command, suggesting that a democratically elected president resigned. This is what we have to deal with during these recent years of historic change in Latin America, where we've seen a series of where we've seen a series of series of progressive governments that have not aligned with U.S. policies. Washington takes these latter for its enemy, and it is destabilizing them ever more brazenly. When it can't do this because of our popular support, it tries to liquidate them by means of lawfare. This criminalization of politics explains what happened with Lula, with Cristina Kirchner in Argentina, and with my vice president, Jorge Glass. Such things are impossible in a state that's based on the rule of law, but they are fine when they are used against left wing leaders. And the next question: Evo Morales seeking asylum in Mexico. Do you think it would have been possible for him to seek asylum in Ecuador? Correa says there are a number of imbalances here. Okay, the U.S. Influence, okay, the blockade, okay, of Venezuela, the Ecuadorian government's handing over, okay, of Julian Assange, and uh, its granting of a new U.S. military base uh, um, in the Galapagos Islands. He said, "I'd welcome a U.S. military base, okay, in Manta if they give Ecuador a military base in Miami." But I've had no reply to this proposal as of yet. People like people like Lenin Moreno persecute us and try to annihilate us as peoples, along with our reputations, by accusing us of corruption and repression. Uh, they create political myths, but trying to eliminate our political movements, knowing that we are the primary electoral force. How could Evo risk going to Ecuador, even temporarily? Okay, when Lena, when even temporarily, when Lenin Moreno is so beholden, okay, to the United States that he won't even allow Evo to pass through Ecuadorian airspace. He did this to demonstrate his submission to Donald Trump. But I think even Trump would laugh, okay, at an underling like him. Luckily, Lopez Obrador is there in Mexico, and he opened his country's doors, okay, to Evo Morales, pursuing its nearly century-long tradition of respect for human rights. Ecuador now has a tense peace following the recent uprising against uh, uh, the administration's policies and cuts to government subsidies. How do you see the current situation after the government deals with various social sectors? And Correa says, this is not peace, but a pacification. Peace is based on truth and justice. This government is keeping control through terror for fear that I will win. When you say there is dialogue with some forces who participated in the protests, the fact is the main group involved in the dialogue was the CONE, the Indigenous Confederation. But the CONE leadership always supported the government, so this was just a pantomime. They weren't just sympathizers. They had people who were ministers in the government. But once the government was weakened, the grassroots rebelled and overwhelmed the leadership. One good thing about our Constitution is that you can avoid chaos by bringing elections forward as a safety valve. So the government agreed to dialogue in order to repeal certain measures. All of this came only after 11 people were dead, along with 1,300 who were wounded, 1,200 who were detained, and the biggest protests in our contemporary history. We saw the most brutal repression we can remember since the military dictatorship, if not much worse. And yet the government wants to act as if the increase in fuel prices was the only problem. Okay, and so Correa goes on now, and I'm going to let you read the remainder of this yourself, unless there's a final end. Yes. So Correa discusses also the situation, okay, in Chile, and gives, I think, some great insights, okay, to what is going on there. He talks about other hopeful signs, okay, as well. Okay, the release, okay, of Lula, the Fernandez victory, okay, in Argentina, with Kirchner, okay, as the vice president, and the popularity, okay, of other leftist leaders. And he says the Bolsonaro popularity is now destroyed. If Lula were allowed to be a candidate, he'd be president. He talks about the changes in Spain and the victory, okay, of a progressive coalition there, which he thinks means that Spain and Europe are going to have to pay closer attention to Latin America. And that will be, he thinks, an important factor in preventing so much abuse, so much of the lawfare, so many constitutional breakdowns, so many coups d'etat. He thinks that Spain, okay, and Europe, okay, are going to have an effect on that. Well, maybe they eventually will, but not as long as Trump is president, because I don't think he listens to anybody. I believe there are hopeful times, but unfortunately, there are both advances and setbacks. Okay, and then he talks of those. He says that the OAS can't serve anymore. And he says we need our own space to discuss our problems, okay, with the United States and Canada, but we must do so in a bloc where we can meet among ourselves to resolve conflicts, okay, and make our decisions. That real space, that serious forum, is the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, CELAC. The fact that Lula is free for now at least raises the prospect of a reconfiguration of CELAC and of steps towards a regional sort of unity. And Correa then replies, yes, the conservatives can throw up obstacles, but they cannot change the course, okay, of history. And he talks, okay, in a hopeful vein, but gives it a historical perspective back to the 60s, 1970s. He says the people are with us, uh, so the elites can continue to delay the course of history, but they won't be able to change it. Okay, going now towards the end. Okay, I think his last statement is quite important, so I'm going to scroll up to get that and give you that final statement. Okay, so Niklas asks, I want to ask you about corruption, which is connected to the question of lawfare you referred to earlier. How can we address this question from the left? And Correa says, unfortunately, corruption is socially accepted. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance. It's one thing to express your values in opposition to corruption, quite another thing to practice them. Everyone tolerates it. Now, they tolerate it here too, don't they? Corruption is a pandemic in Latin America. We eradicated institutionalized, tolerated corruption. But when you fight corruption, you find combinations and secret accounts in Andorra, and you have to fight tax havens. We banned tax havens for public officials. But anti corruption is a perverse and persistent strategy, similar to lawfare. They don't kill you like in the 1970s, but they kill your reputation by talking about corruption. If you want to find something wrong in a 10-year government, then you can. whether it be a misplaced fine or something else you want to call attention to. Governments free from corruption only exist in the United States. Come on, Korea, you're kidding. You're kidding. Our legislators are so bored. It's simply legal corruption. We made it legal here in the United States. There's corruption in Spain, in Germany, in the Vatican. My governments did not tolerate corruption, but with their control of the media, elites can exploit the cases that inevitably do crop up. And where the culprit is in government headquarters, they're in a ministry, the media will blame the president. They whipped up a scandal around me, analyzing my travels, all my emails, my computers, and everything, but they have not found anything. Instead, they just keep repeating that the president is corrupt or that he tolerated corruption, even if we really eradicated it. Same can be said about Lula with Christina, okay, or with Evo Morales. Over time, people have realized there has been more corruption in the last 2 years than in my government over 10 years. But at first, these accusations demoralize even our own activists. Faced with corruption, activists distance themselves for a while. They become inactive, demoralized, but they then recover over time, even if they have suffered some damage. So, in a sense, that what was going on, okay, within the Bolivian situation. People had become, some people had become, okay, a little disillusioned, okay, with Evo Morales because he made some mistakes, which we reviewed in some of the live streams, okay, we previously did. But that did not change the fact that in 10 years he had a remarkable amount of success and very little corruption, if any, in his own person during that particular time that we know about, or on the part of people who were close to him, okay, as well. But still, you make enemies over 10 years. You have disagreements with people over things that are important, that are not even simply fine points. Honest people are going to disagree over strategy. Okay, a leader, but no matter how great, will make mistakes over 10 years. There is no leader of America who did not make mistakes over a lengthy period of time. Washington made mistakes. Okay, Lincoln made mistakes. Franklin Roosevelt made mistakes. All of our presidents since have been replete with mistakes, with errors, and very many with corruption. Not so much hidden corruption, but the legal corruption, okay, that we allow in the United States. The activists cannot lose heart. They have to have a perspective on these things. If they don't, then the kind of perspective that's necessary to keep a reform movement going, not just for 10 years, but for the 20 or 30 years that it may require to really fully implement the changes that are necessary for society, but cannot be achieved. Changes like that simply cannot be achieved. So, I do want to get at least to the next one, because that is a very, very good one and also a very, very short one. It's from today. It appeared, okay, in Jacobin. It was by Carl Bajer. And the title of it, okay, is Elizabeth Warren, New Healthcare Plan Would Doom the Fight, okay, for Medicare for All. Okay, I really agree with this one. I mean, okay, I think, okay, that Elizabeth Warren has certainly policy ideas that have merit and that are very attractive, okay, in many ways. But I think her sense, okay, of struggle in politics and what it takes to change things is just not there, because with her new healthcare plan, okay, really it's a supposedly Medicare for All plan, but the way she hedges it and the way she transitions it and the way she plans it and the blithe assumptions she makes about things that have to be done, which is subject, okay, to political fights, suggest that she doesn't understand politics and she doesn't understand how politics can derail reforms over time, and that certain gains have to be made, fully implemented, fully consolidated. You can't leave things half done through half measures. You can't make a political plan that's going to work over 4 years or something like that. Okay, in many ways, okay, a political plan, okay, is like it's like a military plan. It doesn't survive contact with the enemy. That's what you have to keep in mind. So, Carl says, a recurring argument for Bernie Sanders in this primary is that he understands our obstacles are primarily political, not technocratic, and that he would bring a movement with him to fight for his agenda. Warren's new health care proposal, released yesterday, represents a direct contrast to that approach. NBC News describes its basic architecture. Warren, Democrat of Massachusetts, released her plan for transitioning the country to a Medicare for All healthcare system Friday, splitting the effort into two legislative pushes that would happen over her first term in office, but holding off at first on ending the role of private insurance companies. It is perfectly obvious to anyone who thinks about this for 5 seconds how it would actually play out. During the first legislative push, quote unquote, Republicans would argue that Warren's first bill is a radical communist government power grab doomed to dysfunction and failure, and single payer activists would be back into either abandoning the project or insisting that, yes, the public private plan is actually quite reasonable and good. This would, one, split the movement along the single payer movement he's talking about now. So Warren's way of doing it would split the movement along entirely predictable lines that are completely familiar to left organizers. Quote, let's work with Democrats, unquote, versus, quote, we must hold the line. Now, that's exactly what happened in 2009. Exactly what happened in 2009. There was a strong single payer movement going into 2009. In 2008, it was thought when the Democrats took over the government in 2009, it was thought for a while that single payer was going to pass then. When there was such a big majority for Democrats in 2009 started, the outlook looked very, very good for single payer, provided that Obama, who at one time has said he was a single payer supporter, okay, provided he went along with it and he pushed for single payer. But instead, he was playing everybody for a fool. He had become persuaded long before that single payer was not how he could get the support of the donors and the powerful people he wanted to support him. So he undermined single payer from the start and held out the possibility of a public option for people. The trick sparkle pony of the public option. He held that out on the two progressives and said, this is the way to go. We will do this first. It will be very popular with people. After it's popular for people over a period of time, we will transition to Medicare for all because everybody will take on the public option. That's the line the public option people were giving people at the beginning of 2009. They were advocating for a public option plan that would serve 130 million people here in the United States. And that would give extremely strong competition to private insurance companies, strong enough that in fairly short order it would either make them completely competitive with the public plan, driving costs down, or drive them out of business, one or the other. Okay? What happened? The left was split. They were the public option people, and they were the Medicare for all people, who grumbled and did not fully support the public option effort. Okay? And did not pressure the Democratic Party for the public option effort because the single payer people wanted to hold the line. I was among those single payer people. I lived through what happened. What happened is the president let the Congress chew the public option up, gave it to Nancy Pelosi in the House to work on. Nancy Pelosi assigned it to 6 different committees, or 5 different committees. I forget how many different committees. And what finally came out was a weak public option bill that would cover no more than 10 million people. And that was before the Tea Party got a hold of it during the summer of 2009 with mass demonstrations against it, going to every town hall in the country, protesting against the public option and protesting against the idea of anything public in relation to the insurance companies and muddying the water in relation to any kind of health insurance reform at that time. So eventually the Democrats took them the whole year to even come close to passing anything. Finally, in the end, they abandoned the public option, most probably because they didn't want the public option anyway. And what they developed was the Affordable Care Act, which they finally passed in March of 2010. They had done nothing else significant in all that time. The credit card reform bill stunk. The FinReg bill stunk. Did nothing important. They never got to any bills relating to the climate crisis or climate change. They never got to any education bills. Of course, they passed the CHIP bill. That was good, but relatively trivial. It was a gimme. It was a no-brainer. So they passed it right at the start in just a few days to give the impression they were doing something concrete. They never did anything but waste that whole year in political infighting for the sake, they said, of trying to get a few Republican votes and making this a bipartisan thing. This two different pushes sets up the same thing. She'll make a legislative push for some progress towards Medicare for all. And that will get into the committees, okay, in Congress, and they're going to chew that up. And in order to get something done, in order to show the Democrats did something for people, they'll pass something which is not adequate, but which will be called communism anyway by the Republicans, and people will have such a sour taste in their mouths from all the conflict over it during her first term that the Republicans will sweep into our first 2 years. That in 2022, the Republicans will sweep back into office in the same way. She'll never get a chance for the second push. But anyway, going on with the article. This would split the movement. That was one. Two is undermine the commitment and investment of activists who have reluctantly decided to support a bill that is at odds with what they think really needs to happen with health care in the United States. Yes, we now, on the progressive left, have an idea of what's needed for the United States. And it is not even Bernie Sanders' bill. It is Jayapal's bill, H.R. 1384. That's better than the Sanders bill. In at least 4 ways, it's better than the Sanders bill. It's the bill we should have. And those of us who've been studying healthcare know it's the bill that we should have. 3. Senator Warren's first plan as the reasonable, quote-unquote, compromise. And the second plan as an unnecessarily radical instance of Democrats pressing their advantage. And 4. Exhaust everyone before picking the second fight. Right. She wants to have 2 big fights. She doesn't seem to know that the insurance companies and the other opponents of health insurance reform, what they do is whenever some attempt at change is made that's going to hurt their interest, they fight that change, no matter how reasonable, quote unquote, it seems to be, as if it were Armageddon. They pull out all the stops. That's what they did to Clinton's plan in the 1990s. That managed care plan that originated from Hillary Clinton, that did not survive. They lied the hell out of that. They did the Harry and Louise campaign. They threw all their money at that. They totally defeated it. And the fight in 2009, you would have thought that that little public option of Nancy Pelosi that would cover only 10 million people, the way they talked about it, you would have thought it was the second coming of Joe Stalin. I mean, that's it's the ridiculousness that went on. Those Tea Party people showed up at the town halls, okay, of House people. And such a ruckus was created. The heat was on those Congress people. And they delayed and they delayed and they bargained, okay? And they bargained and they got exhausted. And finally, in March 2010, they passed the piece of crap that's the Affordable Care Act. And I say that's a piece of crap because even taking into account that the Affordable Care Act was passed, the fatalities due to lack of insurance during the Obama administration were in the neighborhood, by my own estimate, of 356,000 fatalities in the period from 2010 through 2016. 356,000 fatalities. Still, and I think that Carl Bajer is absolutely right. He says there's no way the fight for single payer would survive Warren's plan. It is practically tailor made to divide, depress, marginalize, and exhaust any political will for single payer before we've even begun the final fight. A skeptic might say that Warren must certainly know this would happen and is simply triangulating between Bernie and Buttigieg at this point. But her motives are really beside the point. We can generously say that she is being naive, and it nevertheless remains the case that Warren's plan cannot possibly succeed in what it supposedly sets out to do, which returns us to the difference between Sanders and Warren. Sanders understands this is a political fight, and that's why he insists on settling this in one bill, an approach that stands the best chance of keeping the public mobilized. And by the way, once that bill is passed, once it's passed, you can keep the public mobilized for all the other bills. You can keep them mobilized for the Green New Deal bills, all of which have to be supported. Now, the Green New Deal, as everybody has remarked, okay, is just an outline. But the other day, Sanders, with the support of Ocasio-Cortez, introduced the first of the Green New Deal bills. An important bill, but a modest one in terms of spending. Introduced it into this Congress. Or will quickly introduce it into Congress. I'm not sure whether he really did introduce it or not. But it's written. And I'm sure it will be introduced into this Congress before it's over. So, the point is, if you have the big success, okay, on Medicare for All, then Medicare for All will be implemented for the 55s and overs and the under and 18 by the time of the election of 2022. That is very important, that a big segment of the public, a very big segment with the 18 and under and the 55, okay, and over, will experience it. It's particularly important that the people over 65 experience it. Sanders is not as popular as other people with this particular group because they don't understand what the new Medicare for All bill will mean to them financially and in terms of personal security. They still think, it's going to be Medicare extended to everybody and they'll get a few extra things. But it's not just that. It's not just that. It makes a big financial difference to them. And in fact, possibly an astronomical financial difference if they need to go into long-term care in nursing homes, and it's Jayapal's bill that is passed, that will be covered. Their assets won't be lost because they had to go into a nursing home. Anyway, people over 65 don't recognize that yet. They don't recognize it right now. Now, once this bill is passed, they will recognize that. They will recognize how important it is to them. The people in the second group, the under 55s, that in terms of the Jayapal bill will be taken care of in 2023. They will be able to register for that, but they will see what the over 55s have gotten. And there'll be no turning them aside in 2022. Warren, with her initial legislative push and then her second push later, she's going to miss all this ability to keep people continuously mobilized and fighting. So I certainly agree with the final sentence of this article. Warren, for all her technocratic savvy, has badly misunderstood the political problem at hand, and that is why her plan and so many of her plans are doomed to fail. And I entirely agree with this. Warren does not understand the mass politics of the thing. Bernie does. He understands that. He is a mass movement person. He's been trying to create a mass movement for years and years and years and years. And now, in the twilight of his life, he's on the point of doing it. That movement can get him into office. And if he goes after Jayapal's Medicare for All bill, once he gets into office, that movement will be there to sustain him and sustain us and create the changes that we need. Okay, and on that note, I'm going to go to your comments and see what you have to say. Let me change my view here. And let me see how many of you have hung in there with me while I ranted and raved for so long tonight. Okay, well, I see that there are some of you still here. Thank you very much for hanging in. Oh, there's Mad Hildebrand. Okay, so Mad, are you going to run again? Are you going to run on Medicare for All? No compromises. Steve Gonzo says. Well, before I get to that, let me go to some earlier comments. Looks like there are not too many comments, so. Devorah's joined Steve Gonzo and Barbara Reed. Rob says hell. And Rob says hello, hello. And Randy's joined. Margaret Ames has joined. Okay. Also, Nancy Trujinski has joined. And Ernie Simmons has joined. Steve Gonzo has joined. Steve says more than 1 million Jews attended the anti and Nancy Trujinski says Sanders is the only acceptable candidate. Hi, Jim. And Steve says more than 1 million Jews attended the anti-Israel rally in Jerusalem, and that millions of Jews emerged to protest the Zionist state and its a killer army. Well, I got to read that story for myself and see how I interpret it. I presume most of the million were not tourists, okay, to Jerusalem, but were Israelis, right? And if they were Israelis, then probably there are many of their family members who are in the army at this point. Okay, am I right? So I think I want to get that full story and see what it's about. But if you're saying that there are many Israelis, okay, that are in opposition to the government and the way the military acts, but right now, it doesn't surprise me at all. Yeah, Nancy says that Sanders is the only acceptable candidate. Yes, Nancy, I couldn't agree more. He's the only acceptable one to me right now as well. But the more I hear from Warren, the worse I feel about her. I just have this feeling that she just doesn't understand the blood and guts, okay, of politics. It's just, I mean, it is a tough business when people vote you in on a wave of hope, which is what is going to happen in 2020. You have to have a material and concrete success right off the bat, an ambitious program that you push through and you begin to implement and that benefits them immediately. We learned that lesson from Franklin Roosevelt. It's a lesson we should never forget. And the technocrats don't know about that. It's not consistent with their lifestyle. It's not consistent with the kind of literature they read. Okay, Warren's book, the family book, was a very good book. And it had the capacity to make people very, very angry. But Warren herself doesn't call upon that anger. She talks, okay, in an excited way, but she doesn't make use, okay, of that anger. Okay, Bernie does, and he turns it to good purposes. So he is the only acceptable candidate. Okay, so it's getting late. If you've got any more comments or questions that you'd like to add, I'll be happy to consider them. Okay, next time on Monday, I'll consider the Sanders Ocasio-Cortez plan, and I'm sure a number of other things as well. I hope you will tune in. I'm sure I'll have a number of exciting things for you. I thought I had some good things here tonight. Okay, I thought the Correa interview was really terrific. The climate scam. There are a number of great things tonight, I think. Anyway, I'll give you a minute. And in the meantime, please share, like, and subscribe. And please go to my Patreon page, which is at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. And please remember, I have to keep the lights on. That does take a lot of time. And while the government is certainly subsidizing me through Social Security, one cannot live on Social Security alone. Okay, and so Bonnie reminds me every year the rent goes up. Okay, so if there are no more comments, I will say good night, and I'll see you on Monday night. Hope you enjoyed this one.